Good morning, guys. So it's starting to hit 11 o'clock, so I think we're going to take a start. So today, thank you for joining us. You can see we've got a good mix of people all across Europe joining us for today. So good morning, welcome, and salut if you're joining us from Romania. So this week, we're going to be talking about everything you wanted to know about multi-gig Ethernet. So we're going to introduce to you our new range of 5-speed multi-gigabit Ethernet switches. We're going to talk you through a few different things. Let's take a look at the agenda for today. So we're going to start with the 1 gig barrier. I always like to take a look back at the reasons behind what we're introducing. So we're going to take a look at that. That will lead us on to multi-gig in itself, where we'll take a pause to look at some of the technology. We'll whiz through that and straight into the products that are available. And we'll show you a few different use cases where you can apply what we're talking about today. Then we're going to stop for some Q&A so you guys can ask any questions. Now, there is a Q&A option that you can click during the webinar. So if you do have questions that you think of along the way, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A section of the conference, and I will answer those when we get there. So without further ado, the 1 gigabit barrier. So what is the problem? What are we trying to solve with multi-gig? Now, this is going to be something that if you've ever talked to me about 10 gig networking or talk to someone else, it's going to be very similar in terms of what drives us over the 1 gig. And it's all the things that we know we're doing, maybe we take for granted, maybe we know the implications of what it's doing, but things like VoIP, video communications. I'm joining you obviously today over video conferencing. We've got things like video, music, streaming locally, internet. If you're in your office, every IT administrator's worst nightmare, BYOD. You've got IoT devices, NAS and SAN storage. Obviously, when we think about big NAS storage and big data isn't necessarily just to preserve a big business, right? So we can be a very small business producing large amounts of data. And then this is my favorite way. Most people get it when we talk about it like this. And I tend to convert it into films, right? So we all know films. Everyone's got a Netflix account, locally storing films, Google Play, downloading, whatever it may be. Now, if we go back a few years, everyone was stuck in SD. When we look at file sizes, we're looking at 500 meg, there or thereabouts, for an SD film. We jump up and we go to 720 and everyone bought HD-ready TVs. Sizes jumped and we quadrupled. We can be up to or thereabouts at 2 gig. And again, we move to full 1080p. We now start hitting 10 gig sizes. And then the latest introduction is 4K film. And now we sit at 80 gig. And we can take that same methodology. It doesn't have to be films. It can be any types of files or data or things that we're doing on our network. But the general gist is stuff is getting bigger. Data is getting bigger. Files are getting bigger. Requirements of our network are getting even bigger. Now, the answer normally, and what we would generally recommend, is 10 gig. That would be the only traditional option in terms of jumping above the 1 gig barrier. Now, when we're talking about 10 gig, we also need to think about the infrastructure that we're running on. So when we specify 10 gig networks, and we sell an awful lot of 10 gig switches and ready NASs, and we've been championing 10 gig for around about 7 years now, in which time we've seen the price per port of 10 gig drop from a ratio of 4 to 1. So there's been great work there. But the obvious thing is, what about my cables, right? And we can see on the left-hand corner here that if I want to be running 10 gig and I'm sitting on a copper infrastructure, I need to be on at least Cat6a to be running for the full 100 meters. Now, there are alternatives to increasing your bandwidth. And we could look at things like Ether channel, lag, LACP, port bonding, which is going to involve us running multiple cables and bonding those for bandwidth. But again, Now we start to look at the fact that maybe we're losing double ports on a switch. If I have a lot of cable runs, that can be a big increase in cost, as well as the fact that if I'm running multiple cables now, if I don't have them already, well then really, maybe I'm going to be running Cat6a, so it reduces the argument to do that in the first place. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, that takes us onto 10 gig, but what if I can't do that? What if there are roadblocks along the way? Now, here on the left, you can see this is up to 2015, which was the latest stat produced that I could find. But I do have some further insights further along. But we look at the red and the blue parts. This is the world's installed base of Cat5e and Cat6 cables. And in essence, it's telling us that over 75% of the world's cable is Cat5e and Cat6 installed between that time period. So now if I come back to here and I think about, well, I want to run 10 gig, and I know that we've got to be on that Cat6a cable for 100 meters, that's telling me that 75% of people, that is not an option when we're talking about big cable runs or full deployments of networking. And then there's other roadblocks to that as well, because what if I can change the cable? Well, if I think about the increase of shared office space, so what about if I rent my office and I don't own the cable infrastructure? What if I'm in a listed building? And there's a very nice story about where we started on multi-gig, and on our multi-gig journey at NETGEAR, I met a chap who spoke to me specifically about this because of the fact that he was in a listed building, and we'll touch again on that later. What if it's cost prohibitive? What if I'm looking at upgrading from a 1 gig to a 10 gig, but I'm looking at the price of my infrastructure, looking at the price of my switches, and then also I need to now look at the cost of my cabling. You can run approximately between 150 to $300+ pounds per port in terms of laying new cable around your office. So when we start to multiply this can be a very big cost in your network upgrade alone. And then what about timescales? So what if I need a fix and I need it now? And obviously when we take into account the fact that we'd have to look at rip and replaceable our infrastructure, the cables, the floors, the ceilings, sometimes that can be prohibitive in itself in terms of timescales and achieving what you want to do, especially if you are suffering from being stuck at 1 gig and there is saturation or bottlenecks of bandwidth on your network. So then, can you break through? Now, the obvious answer is yes, otherwise none of us would be here on this webinar today. And that brings us onto our introduction to multi-gig. So multi-gig is what we see as the solution of that small, well, I wouldn't call it small, I'd call it big, the big gap in between 1 gig and 10 gig, where we're not only relying on the hardware in terms of the switches, but we're also relying on the cable in between. So our new revolutionary 5-speed multi-gigabit technology that we've built into our new series of multi-speed switches will allow your devices to go straight past that gigabit barrier. And we're going to allow it, more importantly, on traditional Cat5e or Cat6 cable. And we already know that makes up over 75% of the world's cable that's currently being laid or being laid. So multi-gig in itself, we're now looking at the introduction of 2.5 gig and 5 gig port speeds. And the idea is that is going to enable us to build a new 2.5 and 5 gig ecosystem. Now, there's a lot of devices that are starting to hit the market now. Some are already there, some are coming. So we're going to see a whole new plethora of devices that are going to support this 2.5 and 5 gig ecosystem. Things like access points, and we think back to AC Wave 2, and this is actually where we started our journey with 5 gig and 2.5 gig. Punching through the 1 gig barrier on Wi-Fi meant that we had to introduce something such as 2.5 gig that enabled us to do that without the need to run 2 cables. So you can go and see the NETGEAR WAC 740, which is NETGEAR's Wave 2 access point, and this already is available in the market, has been for a while, and comes with a 2.5 gig port. We're also going to see things like wireless routers, NAS boxes, switches, obviously, like we're talking about today. There's also going to be an introduction, and there's already some on the marketplace and in the UK, especially if you go and look at guys like Scan, Dabs, eBuy online. There are already PCI cards available to upgrade things like your home PCs, servers to 2.5 and 5 gig. And we're also seeing the introduction of a new iMac Pro that supports the multi-gig speeds of 2.5 and 5 gig. And that's a big indicator of where things are going. Now, in terms of the technology behind that multi-gig, it is an IEEE standard. So the standard is 802.3bz. That standard itself encompasses and supports 2.5 gigabit second for up to 100 meters of Cat5e cable. It also standardizes is 5 gigabit per second up to 100 meters of Cat6 cable. Now, 5 gigabit up to 100 meters of Cat5e is on defined use cases and deployment configurations. And on my next slide, I'm going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit about those defined situations of 5 gig on Cat5e. But now we also mentioned the N-based T Alliance. Now, NETGEAR is one of the members of the N-based T Alliance, and this consists of more than 45 companies and all the names that you would expect across networking and IT. And their aim and our aim is to have all of our specifications compatible with the IEEE standard to make sure that everything interoperates. Remember, everything that we do at NETGEAR is all IEEE standards to ensure that we can interoperate with other devices. Now, what N-based T brings, as well as that, is the ability to downshift. And downshifting means that, and this will make more sense on the next slide, but if the conditions aren't optimal for you to do things like 5 gigabit on Cat5e, this enables the device to downshift to 2.5 gig across the different speeds to give you a better service along that cable. You can see on the right, again, here's some more stats, and this is from the Delora group. This one was actually done in January this year, and this is showing us that we're going to see a big increase in 2.5 and 5 gig devices, and it's really based around the fact, again, that we go back to the stat of 75% of the world between a certain time period is on Cat5e and Cat6. There is a massive market for a technology like this that provides up to 500% increase in bandwidth. So coming back to the considerations, and if I look at here again, and we said that Cat5e for 5 gigabit is under certain defined use cases, and the key to that is alien limited signal to noise ratio. So alien crosstalk effectively between cables. Now, Cat5e will likely meet 5 gig base T requirements. Cat6 has no risks in meeting either. Now, when we talk about alien crosstalk between cables, what we're referring to is bundled cables. So if we've all ever been in an office and we can see a bundle of hundreds of cables all on a nice tray, this is where we get alien crosstalk. So in smaller deployments, it's not a consideration, but when we start to look at bigger deployments and bundled cables, and as we can see, bundled cables, we're referring to any group of cables that are bundled and touching for at least 1 meter. Then we need to refer to what we see on the right. So we have the risk matrix. As we can see, if we start at the very top of the risk matrix, if we're looking at 2.5 gig and 5 gig in these bundles, and we're looking up to 50 meters, the risk is low, and you are fairly assured of achieving up to 5 gig. When we go into 50 to 75 meters, we can see the risk gets bigger. There is a medium risk to 5 gig on Cat5e. Again, we can see Cat6 is fairly low risk. When we move up into 75 and 100 meters, the risk gets bigger. So if we're looking at Cat5e, 2.5 gig is at medium risk, 5 gig is at high risk. And again, on Cat6, 2.5 gig is at a low risk and a medium risk for 5 gig. But do remember, so this only applies if you are looking at alien crosstalk and you are bundling cables together. Not in that scenario, then this doesn't apply to you. But if you're worried that you are, whether you're going to achieve these speeds, cables can be tested by standard cabling testers using devices like Fluke devices to check for crosstalk. We need to be, in terms of 5 gig, at 250 megahertz in terms of your cable specification. So when they test, it needs to be punching through the standard Cat5e specification of 100. But if you are worried about this, I would encourage you to talk to your cable people, talk to installers, and have those cables tested. But if you're not in that scenario, again, remember 100 meters with a clear line of sight and clear non-touching, non-bundled cables, you will be able to run 5 gig for 100 meters. Now, taking a look at the actual technology, so I want to take you a walk through where this applies to NETGEAR products. But as this applies to several NETGEAR products, the first thing I'd like to do is just walk you through the different features of the different product ranges. So for us, the multi-gig journey actually starts at unmanaged switching. Funnily enough, I don't have a slide for that because it'd be rather empty, but like it sounds, it's plug and play unmanaged. But we then move up into our NETGEAR Smart Managed Plus switches. These will be in 10 gig, multi-gig. They incorporate features such as basic VLANing, either port-based, 802.1q based. We have quality of service, both DSCP and 802.1p, DOS protection, IGMP snooping. So if you are doing things like video streams, multicast streams, loop detection with spanning tree, broadcast storm, very popular for port mirroring, these types of switches, and network tapping. Also very popular for their ingress and egress rate limiting on the physical port itself. That's where we start. We then move on to our Smart Managed Pro switches, where we get more features and a more intuitive web interface. So now we're looking at advanced VLANs, we're looking at protocol-based, MAC-based, 802.1x guest VLANs, more quality of services moving into layer 4 with priority queues for diff serve. We're also looking at static routing, so the ability to apply IP interfaces, SVIs to your VLANs, private VLANs, dynamic VLANs, advanced IPv6, and also layer 2 relays for forwarding services across those broadcast domains. And we move up into the top range of feature sets in terms of NETGEAR switching, and we hit the NETGEAR fully managed range. So we now incorporate CLI as well as the web management that you'll get from Smart Managed Pro. But we now get full layer 3, so we get static routing. We also have dynamic routing for things like RIP and OSPF and BGP. There are forwarders, DHCP server available on the switches itself in certain models, not the ones we talk about today, but you will see stackable models in certain other product categories across our fully managed range. So this is where we have released certain products. These are the products itself in terms of our new multi-gig and 5-speed internet Ethernet port switches. So starting from the very left-hand side, you can see the first 3 switches that we have are unmanaged switches. So simple plug and play. We have a 5, an 8, and a 10 port. Starting with the XS505, you're going to be looking at 5 ports in total. You're then going to have one 10 gig fiber port, and this is meant to be used either as your uplink port, it can be used to extend your network backbone out to the switch, it can be used to plug in a storage server, maybe a ReadyNAS 628X 10 gig. You're then going to get 4 ports, of 5-speed internet. Now for 5-speed internet, we start at 100 meg, so you'll actually notice we've lost 10 meg now. So 10 meg isn't compatible with what we do on the 5-speed ports. But we do believe that the majority of users out there from now are working on 100 meg and above. And 100 meg is still very important for things like VoIP telephones. So for this, those ports will be capable of 100 meg, 1 gig, 2.5 gig, 5 gig, and 10 gig. Move up again. So along the same theory, but we're now at 8 ports, which enables us to get 3 more ports of 5 speed. And then we go up 1 more and we go to 10 ports, 8 ports of 1 gig now, but then 2 ports of multi-gig. So again, now we're looking at potentially amalgamating 1 gig users or 1 gig applications, 1 gig nodes, and then we can create a backbone, be it by 2.5 gig, 5 gig, 10 gig, or, you know, connect up services such as a NAS, storage, or server. So those 3 are all unmanaged switches, simple plug and play. So once we go up, if we look at the GS110 EMX, this is what we would call the plus version of the GS110 MX. So same port counts, but we now get configurable features that we can apply, like we said, things like VLANs, quality of service, loop protection for your network. We go up again and we now break out into our smart managed pro switches. So 2 10 port switches. So the port counts are very similar to the point that they're the same. And what you'll notice is the only difference is the capability to do PoE+. So one is a non-PoE version, one is a PoE+. If we look at the port counts, we're looking at 10 in total, 4 1 gigs. We have 2 ports of 1 gig / 2.5 gig. And then we have 2 ports of 1 gig, 2.5 and 5. Then we have 1 10 gig fiber port, and we have 1 multi-gig 5 speed port, which is the 101, 2.5, 5 and 10. At the very top of the pile, we have our M4200 fully managed switch. Now this was actually our first switch that we released, and this came back in 2016. And the idea behind it, like I said earlier, was the launch of AC Wireless Wave 2. This switch comes with 10 ports, 6 ports of 1.5, 1 gig, 2.5 gig. Then it comes with 2 ports of 1.5, 1 gig, 2.5 and 5. And then we're looking at 2 10 gig fiber ports. And the idea is, across this range, you're able to do line rate. So for every application that you plug in, you can then amalgamate those. We'll take the M42. If I was to plug in everything at 2.5 gig, I then have my 2 10 gig fiber ports that I can carry 20 gig out from that switch. So this is the lineup as we see it today. We're going to be obviously adding further products into that. You will see a whole load of products coming out through the year, and we'll continue to release further products into that range. Where can I use it in terms of deploying it? And this is always with a pinch of salt, because really it's wherever you need it. But these are just a few examples of what you can do with multi-gig. So if we look at potentially creating 10 gig uplinks, so we'll call this a small business network. I can have my 10 gig server or storage, could be a ReadyNAS 528X, 628X. That plugs in on my 10 gigs. I can then plug in potentially lower impact servers at 5 gig, NAS is at 2.5 gig. Potentially I can plug in a way to access point at 2.5 gig, but then I've still got my 1 gig ports out for things like my firewall, where the bandwidth is below 1 gig in terms of my hop to the internet, CCTV, my telephone. Maybe we can expand it out, and I could be looking at 1.1 gig ports. For certain applications, I could be looking at 2.5 gig ports. Maybe it's to create a 10 gig backbone to my core and have the future-proofing to create extra bandwidth on my network. And again, multi-gigabit APs, things like AC Wireless Wave 2, we know, punches through the 1 gig barrier. More applications. Maybe, again, we want to replicate what we would do in big business for bigger networks, bigger deployments. We want to take that same methodology and we want to apply it to smaller switches for smaller networks, smaller applications. So this could be potentially maybe thinking along the lines of a design house media company, CAD design, something they're producing big data. I've got multiple hops. I've got my core switch, which is my XS508M. I've got 10 gig links running out to my 2 edge switches. And again, those are then supplying 1 gig links, 2.5 gig links to my AC Wave 2, and also 10 gig links to my storage. So there's multiple applications in terms of where I can deploy it. So today's webinar was a really quick whiz through. We're not doing a demonstration today, but if I was to akin it to a demonstration, I could run across the room at 1 speed, and then if I ran across that room at 2.5 and 5 times faster than I ran before, you'd get the idea of what we're achieving with multi-gig. So we're going to take a pause for Q&A, and we'll see if we've got any questions at all. If you do have any questions, please put them in. So this doesn't look like we've got too many questions at the moment, so it sounds like potentially everyone gets the idea. It is a very simple concept in what we're trying to achieve here with maximum return in that simple concept. So I can see we've got our first question from Nick. Will there be a larger port density fully managed switch being released? So we are actively working in the background to create more switches and bigger categories. I can imagine when we look at that technology, the obvious is they are very small port count switches at first. We are going to be releasing bigger port density switches, and there will be bigger versions hitting the market this year. Fortunately, I will have to come and kill you all if I tell you any more. But yes, in essence, Nick, there will be bigger versions coming of these switches. You can see we got a question. Who else is offering multi-gig switches in today's market? Oh, well, if we take a look at the bigger, potentially more enterprisey type manufacturers out there, you will see multi-gig switches. It is very new to the market in terms of the port count, the densities, the price points that we're offering it at. The original application, like I said, really in terms of networking came about with AC Wireless Wave 2. In terms of enterprise switches, you will find a small selection from other vendors, but in terms of what we're doing, the application to it, the price points, like I said, the models that we're releasing on and the markets that we're aiming it for, there is not much in the way of any competition there. Got another question. Where do you see the biggest application for these products? Good question. I think it's very mixed. I think the release of things like the Mac Pro with 5 gig ports could be a very good thing for multi-gig in itself and kickstarting the trend with other manufacturers. I really see it as a mix between maybe small business, jumping into big business when we see bigger port densities available, but even potentially the home market. And if I look around, and even if I potentially got, forgive me if my wife's listening, hopefully she's not, but she is a big Mac user from a design, and she's a marketing manager. And for her to have something like a 5 gig port I think the application is still there. We see a lot of guys out using things like Thunderbolt and USB 3 using incredible speeds, faster than what we can achieve on a wire. So that gives us the possibility to bring it back to the wire and then incorporate things like more NASes. We see a massive influx of NASes, not just in business, but in home now. People are storing even more data themselves. So I think number one is going to be AC Wireless Wave 2. That was the original reason, or one of, and one of the biggest applications that came out first. But I think we're going to see it spread to all kinds of things. Like I said, you can go right now and you can buy 2.5 gig and 2.5 gig N-base-T Alliance supported NIC cards. And these are available from online retailers already. Are there? Okay, we've got another question. Hopefully that answers that question. Although I wasn't very specific on where it can be used, I really see the application can be anywhere you need it. And really the key bit is, are you struggling for bandwidth? Are you on Cat 5e? Are you on Cat 6? Do you want to upgrade the infrastructure cable? Do you just need a bit extra? Potentially you don't need to go to 10 gig. Maybe you don't need all that. And in those scenarios, 2.5 gig and 5 gig is the perfect solution. So, see, we've got another one. Are there any study trial cases with ISPs? Very good question. I mean, I think when we look at where we are right now in terms of the actual models, I don't think that in terms of what we're doing at NETGEAR, that those particular switches are ISP plays, or in terms of that side of things, and if you're talking about building ISP networks, but the potential is there. And I do know, and potentially Dan, who asked the question, tee up with me afterwards, and there is a lot of information, not just from NETGEAR, but also the N-base-T Alliance, that we can provide to you and point you in the direction of, that has a plethora of information about use cases, places where it has been used, smaller ISP applications. So there is a lot of information out there that we can follow up on and talk about. I can see we do have another question. So Sam is asking us, where does it sit on price points against standard switches? So there is a very slight increase on price support, but effectively very competitively against original 1 gig switches. Now, I try not to talk too much about things like pricing. I'm a technical person, so I prefer to talk about the technology. If you are interested in things like pricing, this is a pan-European discussion today, so I would encourage you to reach out to your NETGEAR offices, which are localized to your own regions, be it across Europe, be it in the UK or the Nordics. So do reach out to those guys, reach out to your distribution partners that are authorized by NETGEAR, and the same, your authorized NETGEAR reselling partners. Or, like I said, always feel free to reach out to NETGEAR ourselves. And the obvious thing is against 10 gig switches, just to add on to that, Sam, they do come in very, very competitive against 10 gig switches. There is a big price drop between 1 gig, multi-gig and 10 gig. Got questions? So Pleska is asking, is it only audio? There are slides today, so if you are joining, I can see some guys are only joining over audio today. So if you do want to catch up, what we will be doing is we will of course follow up with everyone that registered today. We'll send out copies of the slides. So if you didn't get to catch the slides and you are just following along over the phone, then please do check your emails, follow up with us, and we will make sure you get a copy of these slides. Please feel free to share these slides yourself and if it is useful for you potentially as a distributor or as a reseller, and you'd like to use these to further the message on or take that message to one of your partners, please feel free again to use these slides yourself or send them out to share the information. We've got another question from Nick on, will your 10 gig switches also have multi-gig availability? So the simple answer is no. So if you do have an existing 10 gig switch that is not in itself backwards compatible, that is a pure 10 gig port. But as time comes on and throughout the year, we will see an increase of 10 gig capable switches that also support the 5-speed of multi-gig all the way from 100 to 1, 2.5, 5, and 10. So yeah, unfortunately, if you are on 10 gig already, but remember, we also have the switches that do support 10 gig plus multi-gig. So if you are on 10 gig and potentially you still have some legacy parts of your network over legacy cable, there is still the ability to extend over to 10 gig via the 10 gig uplinks, and then further that via 2.5 and 5 gig on the mixed port speed switches. But we will see an increase throughout the year. We are going to see bigger port density switches being released as well. So I think it looks like we're coming to the end of our questions. If you didn't get something in and you do want to ask, I'll tell you what, it's 11:37, hitting 11:38. So we're going to give it till, I think, 11:39. So if you've got a question, do get it in quickly. I can see we have another question. Got in there just in the nick of time. So is it only a switch or a router? Good question. So they are only switches. So in terms of business class products, this technology NETGEAR is only releasing on switches, but there are switches within that range that have the ability to do routing. So on the high end, we have the Smart Managed Pros. There are 2 models in there. And then we also have the M42 fully managed switch. And again, that is able to do routing across VLANs, IP routing, and across different broadcast domains. So if you are in an existing environment, you can do routing on those switches. No problem at all. So guys, I think this is going to take us up to the end of our session today. So thank you for joining us. I hope it was useful. If you did have anything that potentially you think of after, potentially a question or a query, something relating to 10 gig, multi-gig, or the switch range itself, don't hesitate to either reach out to myself, reach out to your local offices. We're going to follow up with you all afterwards. This is going to be our last webinar for 2017. So for 2018, we're going to be coming up with a whole new schedule. So do keep your eyes peeled, and we will, of course, keep you updated on new things coming. One of the first ones that's going to come is our new ReadyNAS IP CCTV solution with Milestone Arcus. So if you've got the intuition or the bug, please do go and have a search on NETGEAR, ReadyNAS, and Milestone Arcus. So we're going to be talking about that early in the new year. We'll of course roll on to all the new things coming out, and we will let you guys know the schedules and dates as and when they come. Oh, I'll tell you what, we've got one sneaky question that's just slipped in before I say goodbye, so I'm just going to answer that one quickly. The maximum speed of transfer, so you're looking at on multi-gig, it's going to be 10 gigabit per second. If you're looking at negotiating at 5 or 2, you'll be again looking at 2.5 and 5 gigabit per second. 1 and 100 is going to be looking at those sides of things again. So guys, look, thank you for joining us on today's webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you all across from all of Europe. Wish you the very best for the end of your weeks. Please do enjoy your Christmas breaks and holidays and New Year's, and we'll catch up with you again in 2018. Thank you and goodbye.